Poking around at the bottom of my wardrobe with the stout half of a fishing rod, I extracted some sandals from the jumble of never-worn shoes. From time to time a cobra made her home among my shoes, and while she had become tame enough, as cobras do, I always explored the bottom shelf with an element of discretion. Over the years, the snake and I had arrived at an accommodation of sorts, and had come to regard one another as joint tenants. However, she knew that if she made her presence too obviously known, she would again have to undergo the journey on the end of the rod down to the scrubland bordering the garden. If she was home, she was keeping a low profile, which is easy, really, for a snake. Ducking out past the paper wasp nest hanging from my door lintel, I ran, squinting into the bright African morning, sandals slapping against the soles of my feet, to join my family for breakfast on the veranda. At some time in the distant past, tectonic forces had ruptured the landscape, forming a sheer-sided rift valley into which gravity had drawn a tributary of the Crocodile River. The valley was one of the few interesting features and the only verdant spot in an otherwise scorched and arid region. It was 1964, and in this wild and beautiful place my family had made a new home. To an 8-year-old child it was Eden, the baboons barking in the cliffs, leaping with my cousin from the heights into the plunge pool below the waterfall, the owl in my treehouse, hyraxes and antelope living in our garden, and the ruins of an almost forgotten native history etched into the landscape through which my imagination wandered unconfined. Colonial history was better documented, if what partisan. The Boer War had come to the valley 60 years before, the headstones of fallen soldiers still standing in the hollow below the house. Paul Kruger himself had had his headquarters for a while in the ruin that was to become my grandparents' home, and the ghosts of restless soldiers wandered nightly through their living room. Atop the most prominent of the low hills outside our valley, a monument to the enduring craftsmanship of its forgotten builders, were the still-standing remains of a vast African kraal, built for all I knew 10,000 years before by the ancestors of our cook, so long ago that its history had been entirely lost to her oral tradition. My grandmother had a dream once about one of the Boer War graves. Unlike the rest, which lay east to west, this one, intriguingly, lay diagonally southeast to southwest. Paul Kruger had traveled to Switzerland during the end of the war, where he died. He had gone fundraising to replenish his war chest, and had had the booty shipped out to South Africa. What was to become known as Paul Kruger's millions disappeared, and was never recovered. In my grandmother's dream, the treasure was, of course, buried in this strange grave. My visiting cousin and I fetched shovels and dug the grave up. Though the ground was damp and the hollow in which the grave was soft, it took us the best part of 2 days, and there was great excitement when we struck metal at the 5-foot mark. But it was only the rusting remnants of a sheet of corrugated iron that had been used to protect the remains of the owner of the bones which lay beneath. Thinking of Treasure Island, we kept digging. We knew how cunning treasure buriers could be, but it was only a grave. My grandmother swore there was one less shadow roaming the front room after we buried the fellow's bones again, this time facing east to west like the others. The ruins of the kraal on the height beyond the valley were a source of endless fascination for me. The massive black ironstone rocks which littered the area had been used in the kraal's construction, and for this reason the kraal had been designated the Iron Age ruins. There were, however, no signs of smelting, furnaces, or metal artifacts within the ruins, and Stone Age would have been more accurate. I dragged everything from spearheads to millstones out of those ruins. Future archaeologists may one day wonder how a 300-pound ironstone bird bath came to be on a ledge halfway down a cliff in the western Transvaal. It is in fact an ancient grindstone which my cousin and I were too exhausted to roll any further. I had whiled away many an idyllic day fossicking among these ruins in search of the perfect stone spear or arrowhead. We were always more interested in weapons than mundane domestic items that we found. In all our searches we never found an arrowhead. It hadn't occurred to us that these people had not used bows in our minds being an intrinsic part of any ancient man's armory. At that time a leopard had been making its presence felt in the area, killing some of our neighbours' cattle, and coming into closer contact with homesteads than such animals normally do. And I had been drawn to the ruins despite strict orders to stay near the house. In retrospect, the abutment upon which the kraal was sited was probably an ideal spot, high and secluded, for a leopard to rest during the heat of the day. If my parents had known where I'd been going, they would have confiscated my feet. As it was, I would return safely home every evening, happy with my afternoon's prospecting. All week long, a localized pressure system had been building as the heated air rising off the scorched land rose higher and higher, condensing, forming into towering cumulonimbus stacks. The top struck off as they intersected the troposphere. These moving columns grumbled and flashed as they wandered the landscape like tall ships searching for an anchorage. The rain had held off during the spring, and the farmers were becoming desperate. The ground was parched and hard, and the first rain, as always, would bounce off the baked earth and run off into gullies and dry riverbeds, carrying with it another half-inch of dusty topsoil to silt up the dams and strip the earth of fertility. Nevertheless, the rain would be welcomed, and there was a general air of expectancy as man and nature waited for the floating reservoirs to burst. Night had come. Nightfall on the Tropic of Capricorn is a sudden event, with little of the evening twilight of European latitudes. At 7 the sun rolls over the edge, and 10 minutes later the insects and frogs are in full throat, and the indigo heavens are ablaze with an extravagance that I have not seen now for half a century. In the southern hemisphere one looks directly out on the spiral arm of our galaxy. In my youth, the clear desert air allowed this cosmic Catherine wheel to shower down its glory nightly on our valley. I lived oblivious to its splendor, but of all the things I miss, perhaps I mourn this loss most as I grow slowly older under cold and empty northern skies. This night was different, though. We were huddled around our small transistor radio, my mother, my younger sister, and I. My father was away in Johannesburg. We were listening, I remember, to Mark Saxon and Sergei in No Place to Hide. The crackly radio and the hissing of the pressure lamps, the only sounds in the quiet before the storm. Outside the night was black, the stars above the valley blotted out by massing thunderheads. We were the only white people for miles, in a wilderness that was not indigenous to our own mythology, and in the unnatural quiet we were feeling that eeriness that is peculiar to Africa more keenly than usual. My mother, more uneasy, I now realize, than my sister or I, for we had an adult to bolster our nerve, was doing her best to keep the atmosphere comforting and homey, when, spontaneously, and in a most ghostly fashion, the guitar hanging on the wall beside the hearth began to play. All by itself, quietly, but unequivocally, and we all heard it together. A creepy tune without chord or melody, as though a ghost were trying to use the instrument to make his presence known. We didn't wait for confirmation. After a moment of frozen horror, my mother grabbed us up, and falling over one another in our panic, we fled the room. The following nightmare hours were spent cowering under the bedclothes of my parents' double bed, listening to the faint strumming of the guitar from the other room, the lanterns in the living room eventually guttering and going out for lack of pressure, leaving us in the dark. During that night the storm broke. A mighty searing arc burned our retinas, followed by a concussion which seemed to shake the valley walls, as countless tons of air rushed in to fill the scorched vortex left in the thunderbolt's wake. The clouds opened, and with the din of the deluge drumming on the tin roof, we finally fell asleep, exhausted. The chattering calls of flocks of bush babblers coming and going through the morning hedgerows wakened us to a pristine day. I could hear the susurration of the normally sluggish river, now in muddy flood, as it roared through the canyon. I bolted my breakfast in my haste to get down to the river. The flood would subside in a matter of hours, and as the waters receded, I knew that all matter of wonders might be revealed, which normally one may never see. The previous year's flood had washed out a beautiful baby rock python, which, asleep on the riverbank after its ordeal at the flood, had allowed me to approach close enough to throw my shirt over it in an attempt to capture it before it had become startled and wriggled off into the water and away. I clambered downstream along the canyon walls, the roar of the river in my head, crossing from time to time along the trunks of great poplars, fallen giants half the height of the canyon walls. The underpinnings of these great trees had been eroded during floods years before I had come to the valley, and they now spanned the river which had toppled them. Traversing along the base of the cliffs, slippery with the river's spray, I rescued a half-drowned tortoise from a cleft in the rock at the high water mark. It went into my pocket, and a large chameleon clinging to a dry branch which was circling in an eddy below a rapid. In the light of day, I had, of course, forgotten completely about the musical manifestations of the night before. My father returned to the valley during the afternoon, and at dinner that evening, everything was back to normal. The impending storm no longer brooded over the valley, and in the warm glow of the hissing pressure lamps, darkest Africa seemed somehow more cozy. No thought was given to the events of the previous night, until the adventures of Mark Saxon and Sergei were announced once again on our radio. The association with the night before sent a sudden tingle up our spines. "You know what happened last night?" my mother said, speaking to my father, and as she spoke, the guitar once again began its weird tune. My father took the guitar down off the wall and carefully shook out a large moth. The poor thing was trapped behind the strings and had been trying for 2 nights to reach the light from the lanterns. I myself, now older than my father was then, looking out through my grey Kerry winter window, still occasionally play that guitar.